ushering out the long reign of special interests and the radical left lunatics, and we're ushering in the golden age of America. That's what we have.
This is a 33-page document that is probably sitting on every world leader's desk as we speak. It is titled National Security Strategy of the United States of America. And buried inside this is an idea that feels old, almost antique, but it may define how power works in the year 2026. That's next year. And there's this one line that is kind of testimony to that. It says, and I'm quoting, "This document is a roadmap to ensure that America remains the greatest and most successful nation in human history." And there is a signature of the President, Donald J. Trump, just below it. Now, I have read through this document, and it deliberately blurs the line between national security and foreign policy. But it does more. In the year 1823, President James Monroe declared that the Western Hemisphere was America's backyard. The Western Hemisphere being almost half of the Earth, the North, Central, and South America, and also the surrounding water. Monroe saw the zone as off-limits for everyone else. Now, 2 centuries later, the Monroe Doctrine has found its mention in Trump's national security strategy, not as a thing of the past, but as next year's policy. The document says, and I'm quoting from it, "We will assert and enforce a Trump corollary." Now, corollary is just a fancy word for a proposition to the Monroe Doctrine. We want a hemisphere that remains free of hostile foreign incursion or ownership of key assets. Now, it frames Latin America not as a collection of sovereign partners, but as strategic real estate that must be secured, managed, and defended. Now, one immediately thinks of what's happening in Venezuela.
I don't rule out that. I don't rule out anything. We just have to take care of Venezuela. They dumped hundreds of thousands of people into our country.
There are warships surrounding it, fighter jets flying around it, and a constant threat of a full-fledged war from the United States of America. Now, Trump is using Venezuela's narcotics issue to send out a message to the entire region that this version of the Monroe Doctrine is already in the works.
So part of this is the emergence of a new brand of American foreign policy, and I think we can call it a MAGA foreign policy.
So if MAGA foreign policy dictates the Western Hemisphere is owned by the US, does that legitimize Russia's dominance in Eastern Europe, China's ambitions in the South China Sea, or Iran's plans for the Middle East?
What you can see is the very worrying trend, which is all of this is starting to bring the major powers into more direct confrontation. More and more talk we hear about the possibility of a European-Russia war. Just this week, we've had the Secretary General of NATO saying that there's a high possibility that in the next 4 to 5 years of a direct conflict. The US-China conflict, I mean, continuing militarization of these key regions.
What is also very, very interesting here is that the past national security documents have almost always antagonized 2 countries, China and Russia, as their enemies. But this NSS does not reference any major power competition even once. In fact, it paints America as invincible and talks about working to, and I'm quoting again, rebalance America's economic relationship with China. Now, China is mentioned 21 times in this document, but it's more in context of how the previous US administration have left the Asian giant become the world's 2nd largest economy. It has more to do with trade and less to do with security.
I think what happens for China in 2025 was about how China managed Donald Trump and the challenges that the first year of the Trump administration threw up. And the Chinese would be feeling quite smug about it. that they have handled Trump very well.
But this changed approach for China also worries some experts.
I'm particularly concerned about what President Trump might give up in other strategic areas having to do with AI, having to do with Taiwan, having to do with U.S. allies in the Indo-Pacific in exchange for a trade deal with President Xi that seems favorable.
Also, Trump's outlook on Europe is more on the expected lines. The section starts with the line, and I'm quoting again, American officials have become used to thinking about European problems in terms of insufficient military spending and economic stagnation. The document goes on to say that the continent is at risk of civilizational erasure. This bit, that almost sounds like a rant, effortlessly flows into the war in Ukraine.
You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III.
But the war is posed as a problem to be managed, not a fight to be won.
The fundamental points of failure, I believe, in President Trump's Ukraine policy are that he misunderstands Russian President Vladimir Putin and his motivations. And so even in those times when President Trump has been willing to exert extraordinary pressure on the United States Ukrainian partners, think back to that Oval Office meeting in which President Trump berated President Zelensky in front of the press. Nevertheless, there has not been a resolution to the conflict. And the reason is that President Putin has not yet wanted the war to end. He still sees more benefit in continuing the fighting. And in part, that's because at the end of the day, Putin thinks that Trump is not on the Ukrainian side.
This document is the latest and clearest expression of Trump's desire to shake up the post-World War II order. Washington wants to, at least for the next 3 years, look at everything through an America First lens. We spoke about China, Europe, Russia, but what about the smaller countries? Japan, the Philippines, Australia, treaties that were once considered ironclad now feel conditional after the year 2025.
The question for 2026 and beyond is there going to be a crisis where the United States is called upon to actually act on its Article 5 responsibilities to defend its allies? And what does it do if that happens? So that could look like stepped up Russian incursions into NATO territory. That could look like Chinese action or aggression against Japan, for example, or even the Philippines. And that will really call the question of to what extent does the United States under President Trump still live up to its treaty obligations?
Also, there is no doubt that Trump has a history of unconventional foreign policy moves. But as the US stops pretending to run the world for everyone and prepares to run it for itself, the world is adapting fast. If in 2025, Venezuela looked at China for security, Russia hired a businessman to woo Trump, and Denmark told Trump to keep his hands off Greenland, who knows what will happen in the year 2026? We'll have to wait and watch. I'm Ananya Datta. Thanks for watching Hindustan Times.